Hey class, Mr. Coster here. Welcome to Chapter 4. In today's lesson, we're looking at Chapter 4.1, which focuses on the social classes of colonial society and also family life. Social classes, there are three main classes: the upper, middle, and lower classes. On this slide here, we're looking at the upper class. In New England, the upper class were made up of merchants, people who sold things out of a store, traders, and clergymen. Clergymen are like pastors. In the middle and southern colonies, the upper class were made up of those large landowners, the plantation owners. They had the most money, they had the most influence. Some people had gained their upper class status based on political positions, or others had had wealth passed down to them from their families. And these people could enjoy really nice homes, luxuries, furniture they would import from places like Europe. Their sons would even go to college in Europe. So they just had extra money to do a lot of different things. This were the middle class, and of course most colonists were in that middle class. They weren't poor, they weren't rich. Some of them had even made their way up the social ladder and got some new things along the way. And most of this group were just your working class people. They were they were subsistent farmers, clergy members, shopkeepers, carpenters, blacksmiths, your everyday working class people. They had modest, nice homes, nothing fancy, but they were the backbone and the heart of America, and most Americans would have fallen into that middle class category. That is the lower class, and the reality is there were very few people in the colonies that fit that category. There weren't very many that were extremely poor. The one group we've talked about before that was in that group were the slaves. They were at the very bottom of the social scale. They had no rights, no freedoms, could not own their own land, and of course they were regarded as property. So by far the smallest group, but also the group that were made up of slaves. A few terms I want you to from this section: aristocrat, redemptioner, and indentured servant. An aristocrat were the very upper class of people. They had refined tastes and refined manners. A pretty small percentage. They were the aristocrats. A second group were called redemptioners. What's a redemptioner? These were people who were in Europe and wanted to come to the New World, but they didn't have the money to make it. So what they would do is they would get a free ride over to Europe, over to America, and hope that somebody would redeem them. Redeem them by paying the ship captain whatever money they owed. And then they would agree to work for that person for a certain amount of time. They were a redemptioner. And the third group was an indentured servant. These were typically young men aged 18 to 30, and they would come over to America and they would work for maybe a blacksmith, and they would learn the skill, learn the trade for 6-7 years, and then were allowed to go and have their own job and own career. But it was about a 7-year process where you learned a skill and worked for somebody else. There were definitely three groups, different parts of society that played an important role in colonial America and just colonial life. And then looking at families like today was an incredibly important part of their life. It was the center of their life. Families back then were a patriarchy, and that meant the father was the head of the household. The Puritans especially believed that the family was a reflection of the church on the community. And you won't believe this, if kids were unruly or misbehaved, a father could be punished for not appropriately leading his family. God is a God of order, and a family out of order meant the dad must have been doing something wrong. So it's so important for a father to lead his family in a godly, biblical way. Husbands and fathers were expected to provide financially for the family. They were to guide the family in social and spiritual matters. They were the free men who owned property and they were allowed to vote. They were the ones who were leading society and played an incredibly important role, but the family was the center. Women's role was different in that time period. A man was looking for, of course, a godly wife, someone who would support him in his work, keep the house, take care of the house, and to raise his children. And that was really important to these guys. Notice on there was nowhere for like he wanted a hot wife. No, he wanted a godly wife who would support him and keep his house and his children. And women really worked in the home. They weren't working outside of the house at this point. They're providing meals, and that was often an all-day task. It was a lot of work to prepare a meal because there was no grocery store to go and buy your things from. There were no modern appliances, no running water. The wife typically took care of the animals, milked the cows, baked bread, harvested food from the garden. They also made things that might last into the wintertime. They'd make their families clothing, and they were typically the ones who were responsible for their children's education. It's important to note that while it was a patriarchy and the man was the head of the family, the men saw the women as equals. They just had different roles. But to the Puritans, men and women were absolutely equal before God. They just had different roles to play. And of course, children learned how to be helpful around the house. Girls would learn how to care for the home from their mother. Boys would learn a trade, learn a skill. Usually about the age of 14, they might go and start learning a trade so that they could then provide for their family someday. And slaves also, families. This was one time when slaves kind of had some normalcy in their life. However, the fact that they could be bought and sold at any time made it really difficult for them to have normal families. And they would get married, but the state did not recognize their marriage. But between them, between God, they certainly were married. They at times couldn't even live with their spouses, but that was the risk they took. But you would live on a plantation long enough and you fell in love, and you would go ahead and get married. And so that kind of became a big part of their life then. Most slave children were raised by older slave women because they weren't working anymore, and the parents were off to work. And typically a slave child would begin working at about the age of 10. So, different social classes, lower, middle, upper classes, and then the family. The family, again, was the center of colonial life in the colonial period in America.